for joining us, everybody. Those of you who are affiliated with Santa Clara University and those of you from outside the university as well. This panel is sponsored by Santa Clara University's Environmental Justice and the Common Good Initiative, which provides training, resources, and networking to foster community-driven research for social and environmental justice. My name is Chad Raphael. I'm a member of the interdisciplinary faculty collaborative that steers the initiative. Today, you're going to hear from several of the recipients from our first round of research grants. These grants support research on environmental justice issues, and a lot of the projects take a community-engaged research approach, collaborating with local partners to design and conduct the research. You can read more about these projects at our website, www.scu.edu/EJ. I want to thank Maria Eugenia Flores Gomez for helping to organize this panel, Jaylene Solis for publicizing it, Annie Lau for her technical support, and other members of the initiative's grants committee for helping me to select the recipients. That includes Chris Bacon, Iris Stort-Fry, and Ed Maurer. In addition to today's presenters, we funded many other projects over the last couple of years, including these, which you can read about on our website, including projects on mapping the legacy of redlining in San Jose, neighborhood resilience and community garden research, coastal reclamation in Indonesia, several projects with youth in schools that are arts-based on climate and racial and environmental justice, a research practice partnership with beginning STEM teachers and their students in East San Jose, and a project on fair distribution of electric power via microgrids. Here are the folks you're going to hear from today, and this is the order in which you'll hear from them. To maximize their time and to avoid me speaking for them, they will introduce themselves during their presentation times today. Because we only have an hour with you today, we won't have live Q&A during this session, but we invite you to email any questions to the presenters at the email addresses that I'll put into the chat in a moment and which will be shown at the end of today's session. We'll put a recording of this panel on our website later on. Lee Panich is going to get us started. So let me unshare my screen and turn off my video and my mic so that Lee can take it away.
All right, thank you, Chad. Hopefully this is up and working. So we'll be presenting on some research that I've been conducting with the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and student researcher Teresa Contino here at Santa Clara. And we've been working with Charlene Nijma, Monica Arellano, and Gloria Gomez, who are all in the leadership of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. And our project is looking at what types of ecological knowledge are present in the field notes from early anthropologists who worked with tribal elders here in the Bay Area in the early 20th century. And how can we kind of restore some of that knowledge back to the community? Because it's been, as we'll discuss, kind of locked away in these field notes for about a century. And so I'll hand it over to Monica, who will introduce herself and talk a little bit about the history of the tribe, I believe.
Thank you, Lee. Hoshetuhi, Ganakrakat, Monica Villariano, Wachash Kuchush, Muwekma Ohlone Tribe, San Francisco Bay Area, Tak. Good day, I am Monica Arellano. I am the Vice Chairwoman for the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area. I'd like to provide an introduction to the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe and our connection to the tribal area. The present-day Muwekma Ohlone Tribe is comprised of all the known surviving American Indian lineages aboriginal to the San Francisco Bay region, who trace their ancestry through the missions Dolores, Santa Clara, and San Jose, and who are also members of the historic federally recognized Verona Band of Alameda County. The Aboriginal homeland of the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe is the San Francisco Bay Area. This large, contiguous geographical area, which historically cross-cuts Aboriginal linguistic and tribal boundaries, fell under the sphere of influence of the three missions mentioned between 1776 and 1836. The missionization policies deployed by the Catholic Church and military, supported by the Hispanic Empire, brought many distantly related and in some cases already intermarried tribal groups together at the missions. Prior to the American conquest of California, 1846 to 1848, some of the secularized Mission Santa Clara Indian families obtained formal Mexican land grants, while the majority of others found refuge on the rancho lands of friendly California families in the East Bay. After the American takeover of California, there were Indian rancherias established on rancho lands in the East Bay. At least 6 Muwekma Indian rancheria communities emerged and maintained themselves during the early 19th and early 20th centuries in the East Bay. These rancherias were located in San Leandro, San Lorenzo, Alisal, Pleasanton, Sonol, Del Mocho and Livermore, El Molino and Niles, and later a settlement in Newark. The missions were supposed to give land back to the tribes of the area, and they did not, which caused and continued to cause the marginalization of disenfranchisement of our people. We are still without a land base, even though the missions were supposed to allocate land to us, and the American government was supposed to buy land through a congressional act of 1906. Our story today tells of our survival. We are still here, and with the help of Santa Clara University, Lee Panage, and other people, we're able to tell our story by looking back at such things like the J.P. Harrington notes, where there's rich history stored that we're happy to bring forward and share with the public today. Thank you very much. Lee?
Great. Thank you, Monica. That was great. And so that's kind of the context for what our project is. You know, I think we start from the premise that the Muwekma Ohlone people are still here. They're a thriving community today, but we also have to take into account the historical circumstances that have led to alienation from their ancestral lands, and in some cases that means the knowledge of those lands and the resources within them, the animals and the plants, and all of that has gone dormant. And so for this project, really the key for the potential there is that these early anthropologists went out and talked to their ancestors, to their elders, and wrote down a lot of this knowledge that they had from in the early 20th century, but that related to earlier times as well. And so there's really a lot of potential there. I'm just going to bring forward that history that Monica laid out for us a little bit, is kind of understanding where anthropology kind of intersects with this. And of course, I'm in the Department of Anthropology here at Santa Clara, and I'm an archaeologist by training, but I think more and more my focus is really kind of on the archaeology of anthropology. What is the history of our discipline, and how have we been implicated in some of these injustices and inequities that have taken place here in California and other places? And when we look at the Muwekma Ohlone tribe in particular, what we see is anthropology is complicit in the fact that the tribe today is not federally recognized, although as Monica pointed out, they were previously acknowledged by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they were never officially terminated. And so part of that, what the tribe calls the politics of erasure, is wrapped up in how early anthropologists viewed their ancestors. And Alfred Kroeber, who is kind of the dean or the grandfather of California anthropology, really employed a methodology that wanted to try to understand what life was like before the arrival of Euro-Americans to California, and really focused on interior groups who hadn't been involved in the missions. And when he looked at the groups that had been in the missions, what he saw didn't meet his kind of essentialist understandings of what Native cultures should look like. And so he basically wrote off most of the missionized groups, including what he called the Costanoan group, but which today we would consider Ohlone, and of course within that the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. And so anthropology is wrapped up in this current political situation. But there was another anthropologist that Monica alluded to, and that's J.P. Harrington, and he worked for the Smithsonian. Kroeber was at UC Berkeley. And Harrington was kind of an eccentric fellow. He's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but he took a different approach, and he really saw a lot of value in working with all kinds of different tribes all up and down the state and into what's today Mexico and into the Great Basin, and left just a treasure trove of information about Native life in the early 20th century. And this is, for our purposes in this project, he worked with the Muwekma elders who were living there in Alisal, or what's today Pleasanton, and the surrounding rancherias and Niles and Sonol in the 1920s. And he interviewed noted elders like Jose Guzman and Angela Colos. And for us at Santa Clara, I think this is really important because, the mission is here on our campus. And, as I was discussing and what Monica kind of laid out, the current situation has a lot to do with that history of the mission. And because, we're part of this institution, I see it as kind of an ethical imperative to think through that and think about what we can offer as an institution to try to remedy some of these inequities. The other part is there's a direct, lineal connection. Angela Colos, her parents were married in the Mission Santa Clara Church in the 1830s. And so, these folks who talked to the anthropologists in the early 20th century also had a connection to this place where we are today. So one of the issues though with Harrington's field notes, and he took, extensive notes, like I said, with tribal communities all up and down California and adjacent areas, but these were until very recently hard to access. The Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, I believe, has some version, and the rest were on microfilm at the Smithsonian Institution in DC. And so these are, on the one hand, there's those barriers to access, and this is, information that was from these communities. And in many cases, this is the only place where it is, because unlike Kroeber, Harrington never published his findings for the most part, and certainly not the findings that would be relevant to the Bay Area and the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. And so part of this project is to go into those notes and see what we can find about topics that would be important to the tribe, but also, and for the case of this environmental justice initiative, thinking about those environmental justice applications of reconnecting people to that knowledge about landscape stewardship, cuisine, and so on. But like I said, there's some challenges, there's access challenges. And then also, if you look at the image here, the notes are difficult to decipher in some cases. He talked to dozens and dozens of tribal elders all over California, and he had his own kind of shorthand. He wrote in a combination of English and Spanish, because many Native people in this area whose ancestors have been in the missions spoke Spanish, and he wrote in the native languages and also in Latin sometimes. So it's a real trick to kind of get at that information. But there's a lot of really great stuff. You'll see these, in some cases, hand-drawn maps that shows particular areas, people's houses, but also gathering areas, and just great descriptions of the landscape and the way people interacted with it. And of course, he's writing in the 1920s, but a lot of this information that he's eliciting pertains to earlier times. So what we're doing is with Teresa, our student researcher, and kind of guided by the tribe's interests, we're going through these, as seen in the previous screen, the facsimiles or the microfilm versions of the original notes, and trying to create an intermediate step. The ultimate goal is to create a finding aid for the tribe so that they can more easily and readily access this information for their own purposes. But this intermediate step is kind of going through the notes and trying to put order to it. And so it's on, now it's, you can obtain it as image files, but it originally was organized by microfilm. So it's still organized by the reel number, and then within that, which image in the reel. And then what we've done is we've kind of started to code it a little bit about what the primary topic is. Is it language? Is it the natural world? Is it a geographic location? And then coming up with kind of a summary that then eventually we'll be able to put together in an index and a more useful finding aid with the printouts of the actual pages for the tribe to use. And so, in talking to Monica and Charlene and Gloria, again, all, part of the Muwekma tribal leadership, and thinking about what would be most useful, we've kind of started to hone in on a few topics, as related to this grant in particular, plant use and food. There's a lot of really interesting information about plants and how they were, and how plants and animals were prepared in the past, hunting and gathering locations. And again, if you think about this, this is information that was collected in the 1920s in most cases, but there was still, even through all the hardships that Monica described, there was so much knowledge that these folks, that Angela Colos and Jose Guzman and others had, even well into the 20th century, about where to fish for sturgeon, where to go for a particular plant, this kind of thing. There's also more kind of sensitive information that that is more, the tribe is interested in more particularly for their own purposes and not necessarily for public consumption, but about dance and things like that, that's in there, and we're hoping to be able to kind of point them in the direction of where those passages are. And then also, because Harrington was primarily a linguist, there's also quite a bit of information about the Chochenyo language. And so we're hoping to be able to make this useful to the tribe's language committee who is, restoring a lot of the language as well for contemporary use. And so that's really kind of the nuts and bolts of it. So, with guidance from the tribe, we're going through those kind of messy, complicated handwritten notes and trying to put order to it. So I kind of did a first pass, and then Teresa, the student researcher, is kind of coming through and trying to also take a look at the originals and then also kind of put things in order by these topics that then we'll kind of take that back in an iterative process to the tribe and see, like, does this make sense? How does this, how would this be useful for you in the final product? And then we'll put that together for the tribe. So that's, and with the funding, we're able to pay for the student researcher. We're able to compensate the folks from the Mwekmaloni tribe who are participating in this project, and hopefully to be able to produce the finished product. And then just to end on kind of the kind of how does this fit in to the overall topic of environmental justice. And again, getting back to what Monica was talking about at the beginning, we can think about environmental justice as, in some ways, kind of thinking or examining how different planning policies or environmental changes or human-induced environmental changes affect different types of communities. And across the board, research shows that communities of color are disproportionately affected by many of these decisions and processes that are in place in our society. And if we think about that in a long-term historical perspective, we can also see that Native communities are for them, colonialism has amplified those effects. And so, for the Mwekmaloni tribe, the key thing is, again, to start from this, vantage point that they are still here, that they're still a thriving community. But when we look at the Bay Area, a lot has changed, and a lot of that is, due to colonialism, and people have been alienated from their lands. They can't practice their traditional landscape stewardship practices, can't access areas for hunting and gathering, and so forth. And so, from the vantage point of the 21st century, we can step back 100 years to the early 20th century when, tribal elders related a lot of this information to anthropologists, and in this case, J.P. Harrington in particular, and we can try to reclaim that information for the tribe. And so that's really what this project is hoping to achieve. So I think that's about it for time. Monica, did you want to add anything else?
I think you covered it very well. So thank you, everybody, for listening to our presentation. I hope you learned a lot about Mwekma and our tribe. Thank you.
All right, great. And thanks to the organizers. This was looking forward to hearing the other presentations. And thanks again to the Environmental Justice and Common Good Initiative. And I also just want to shout out to our other collaborators on campus, Amy Luke and Lauren Baines, who also do a lot of work with the tribe.
Yes.
All right, thanks. I will turn off now.
Thank you so much, Monica and Lee. Really appreciate your presentation. Our next presentation is going to be on heat risk and Silicon Valley's unhoused residents. So CJ and Jamie and team can take it away.
Great, thank you so much. Hello, my name is Jamie Chang. I'm an assistant professor of public health here at Santa Clara University. And I'm happy to be here today with Professor CJ Gaby of Environmental Science and Studies, and our wonderful student researchers, Mariah Campson and David So. So we'd like to start off with just a bit of background on the unhoused population in Santa Clara County. So the latest point in time count, and that's the biannual count of unhoused people, occurred in 2019 and estimated that there are approximately 9,700 unhoused people living in Santa Clara County. And an astonishing 82% of these individuals are living unsheltered. Santa Clara County has one of the highest rates of unhoused people who are unsheltered in the nation. And I think it's something that many of us in California take for granted. Also notably, this population of people who are unsheltered is increasing substantially. The unhoused, unsheltered population increased 45% since the 2017 point in time count. And this is largely because the unhoused population continues to increase, indeed skyrocket, while the shelter system has not expanded. So, all unhoused people are vulnerable to the risks of heat, but especially those who are staying unsheltered in a tent or a vehicle. This is because people who are unhoused have substantially more exposure to heat than housed people, and simultaneously because they have less means and resources to protect themselves. In the literature, there's strong evidence linking environmental conditions to poor health outcomes for unhoused people, but most of this literature tends to focus on cold and wet weather conditions or extreme weather events. There's actually very limited research on the experiences and the effects of heat on unhoused people. So for this study, we set out to use the mixed methods approach to investigate unhoused people's exposure to heat, as well as their adaptive capacities.
So as Jamie mentioned, we've taken a mixed methods approach to think about the aspects of the geography and lived experiences of unhoused people in terms of heat. So to that end, we've asked 3 research questions. Are unhoused people in areas of greater heat risk, particularly when we think about outdoor temperatures and tree canopy and shade? What neighborhood characteristics are associated with where unhoused people are living? And could some of these neighborhood characteristics affect unhoused people's heat vulnerability? And then how do unhoused people describe the impact of heat on their health and along with their access to basic prevention measures? So we've taken this mixed methods approach that essentially has 2 interconnected parts. The first part is a spatial and regression analysis that includes descriptive statistics, cluster and hotspot analysis at the census tract level, and a set of regression models. And then the second part, which is looking at the lived experiences of unhoused people, we've done in partnership with the Downtown Streets team, a local nonprofit organization, through 48 surveys and 10 interviews. So I'll first start talking a bit about what we've done and found in our spatial and regression analysis. So we've tried to combine a bunch of different data sets that get at where are unhoused people living, what are some of the dimensions of heat exposure, and then what are some of the other neighborhood characteristics that may be at play here. So in terms of unhoused locations, we're using the biannual point in time count from 2019, which is a biannual HUD required survey, and that's at the census tract level, and that's includes sheltered and unsheltered people, and we're focusing on unsheltered people. We also do our analysis using data from unhoused deaths that occurred between 2011 and 2019 across the county, and we've summarized those by census tract as well. Just in the interest of time, we're mainly going to focus on these point in time counts, but our other results are available. If you want to send us an email, we're happy to share those. We use land surface temperatures on a hot August 2020 day as a measure of heat exposure, and we use census tract estimates of tree canopy coverage. And then we're thinking about some of the neighborhood characteristics that relate to the built environment, income levels and poverty, renting versus homeownership rates, race and ethnicity. So as you can see from the map on the left, homelessness doesn't occur evenly or randomly across Santa Clara County. You can see here in terms of where unsheltered people are residing, about 2/3 of the unsheltered people in Santa Clara County live in the city of San Jose. And we note that about 3/4 of the unhoused deaths in the county occurred in San Jose. I'll point with my cursor, hopefully you'll be able to see it, but we can see kind of corridors along the Guadalupe River and the Coyote Creek as 2 areas where we see unsheltered residents the most. But additionally, there are pockets of unsheltered residents in other places, including some of the more northern parts of the valley, including in Sunnyvale and Mountain View and Palo Alto. In terms of the descriptive statistics of the neighborhoods where there are more unsheltered residents, the figure at the table at the right shows that there are some statistically significant differences in the neighborhoods that have more unsheltered residents than all of the other tracts. And that includes higher temperatures, less tree canopy, lower incomes and higher poverty rates, much more renters, fewer white residents and more Hispanic or Latino residents. So we can start to get a sense for some of the factors that are shaping where unhoused people live here in Santa Clara County. Then we started to look at where are clusters where higher temperatures and unhoused people, where do these intersect? And where do unhoused people and tree canopy, a lack of tree canopy, intersect? And we can see at the map at the left, there's one large cluster. So that's shown in red here. I'm showing it with my cursor, where we can see this is kind of the largest area of high surface temperatures and unhoused people. And it's really bisected by Coyote Creek and Monterey Road. And then there are several other hotspots in and near downtown San Jose, including near Regional Medical Center. In terms of tree canopy, we see a relatively similar geography, but we also see some tracks along the Guadalupe River, including near the airport and in and around downtown San Jose. I wanted to note there was one track that we saw up near the Castro City neighborhood of Mountain View, where there actually were high numbers of unhoused people and actually high tree canopy coverage. So that's going to be something we're going to look at a little bit more. Then getting into the regression results, we started with looking at bivariate associations between unsheltered residents and temperatures and less tree canopy. And as you might be able to imagine, we found that unsheltered residents were associated with higher surface temperatures, less tree canopy coverage. But then the story got a little bit more complicated when we started to do the negative binomial models, where we looked at other neighborhood factors along with these heat risk factors. So the heat risk factors were our primary variables of interest, and we found that those weren't statistically significant when we controlled for other neighborhood factors. I think the most interesting result was that the percent of homeowners was negatively associated with unsheltered residents, but there weren't any other significant relationships, including other income-related variables or other variables related to race or ethnicity. So this part of our study is pointing toward another example of thermal inequity from the literature in terms of disparities in exposure to heat. But we're discovering that heat-related factors may not be the primary locational drivers. In fact, the best predictor of where unhoused people lived and where unhoused deaths occurred was neighborhood homeownership rates. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Jamie to start talking about our part B of results about lived experiences.
Great. Thank you so much. So we wanted to examine the lived experiences of unhoused people managing extreme heat. And to do this, we conducted two projects involving qualitative approaches. First, we partnered with the Santa Clara County Public Defender's Office and conducted a community needs assessment surveys on site at the Columbus Park encampment. And in this survey, we asked a lot of questions, but pertaining to this study, we were interested in participant sources of water. We also conducted in-depth semi-structured interviews by phone, partnering with Downtown Streets team. And what we did is we conducted phone telephone interviews with their peer staff, most of whom had been unhoused themselves and are working actively in the encampment settings. And in these in-depth interviews, we discussed three key areas: the health effects of heat, the specific challenges faced by unhoused people, as well as adaptive strategies.
As we mentioned in the introduction, due to the inadequate shelter system, the vast majority of unhoused people living in Santa Clara County are living outdoors without stable forms of shelter. Unhoused people are living in trailers, cars, and tents, or without any protection at all, through the extreme heat of the summer months. And as CJ discussed, our findings show that they are doing so in hotter areas with less tree canopy and less shade. The site of the Columbus Park encampment, where we conducted interviews, is depicted here in the red box. This site is located in regions that correspond to the map CJ mentioned a few moments ago. This is an old neighborhood about 10 blocks large that was demolished 30 years ago in order to create a flight path for airplanes going to the Mineta Airport. To give you a sense of what this looks like, pictured here is a photo from the Columbus Park encampment. This large, sprawling encampment has made headlines due to its large size and large population, with some estimates up to 300. This is an example of the open, exposed, vulnerable conditions many unhoused people in Santa Clara County face. There is almost no protection from the sun, no bathrooms or showers, and no proximate sources of water. This site is regularly visited by church groups and nonprofit organizations, although there are no major services provided by the local government here. These individuals and families are on their own, facing extreme conditions without reliable support. We wanted to know why people who are unhoused are more likely to live in such exposed areas. In our in-depth interviews with peer staff at Downtown Streets, one of the questions we asked was, why are people staying in areas more exposed to heat? A major theme that emerged from the participants' responses were related to encampment abatements or sweeps. In particular, this quote from a Pacific Islander woman in her 50s encompasses the general sentiment from many of the people we spoke to. She told us, there's a lot of unhoused people off of Coleman Avenue by the airport. There's a whole colony of homeless people, and a lot of them are not shaded. It's a big piece of land where no one is telling them to get off, and it's all they can find. There's nowhere else to go. These participants described that the underlying driver of unhoused people staying in hot, vulnerable spaces is a social policy, encampment abatements. Unhoused people are not in exposed outdoor spaces because they want to be, but rather they are there because these are the spaces that are less susceptible to a destabilizing event such as being swept.
Since there are no official services providing basic necessities to individuals living in encampments, we were interested in how unhoused people were accessing some of the basic resources they needed to stay alive, including water. This was one of the questions we asked at the Columbus Park encampment. Here we have a bar graph of participants' responses to the question, can you describe how you are accessing water at the site? Responses to this question were organized into 3 categories of comparison. Outside includes participants who receive food and water from community resources or volunteer donations. Self includes participants who receive water themselves, their family members, or from the store. As you can see, majority of the participants heavily rely on outside resources, particularly volunteer groups and church groups, for their water. For these individuals, there is no regular water supply available at all. They rely on piecemeal efforts to small local organizations. When participants obtain water through their own means, they sometimes purchase gallons of water from grocery stores or gas stations. But more often than not, participants describe having to ask for free water from local fast food restaurants, cafes, or any public spaces like libraries or businesses for their tap water sources. In other words, many unhoused people had to resort to criminal activity to obtain basic necessities like water. In our study of the experiences of extreme heat on health of unhoused individuals, many participants describe observing or experiencing these main health issues, where 90% of the participants responded with dehydration, 70% on migraines, and at least half of them on sunburns. From our in-depth interview, we got a chance to learn about some of the unique circumstances unhoused people face in extreme heat conditions. First, many participants described the effect of COVID-19. At the start of COVID, shelters reduced capacity and thousands of unhoused people had to live outdoors entirely unsheltered. There were many more unhoused people who were exposed to extreme weather due to the pandemic. Also, many types of cooling systems that house people take for granted are completely unavailable for people who are unhoused, including fans, air conditioners, showers, water, ice. This is a particular challenge for those who lived in cars, tents, because cars and tents lacked air circulation and it got extreme hot and stuffy during high temperatures. Participants reported their safety concerns around opening windows, doors of tents vehicles for unhoused people, particularly at night when people are trying to rest. They described feeling unsafe and unable to sleep when cracking the window for some air. Finally, people use substances to cope with extreme heat. Potential health concerns included dehydration, heat stroke, fainting, dizziness when substances are used without access to water and cooling systems.
So these results, these preliminary results, I should say, have some implications for planners and policymakers, and we're working to think through what will be our set of recommendations coming from this. But I think fundamentally, stable housing is an absolute necessity in terms of reducing heat exposure. In the shorter term, the encampment policy really needs to be rethought at the local level. The practices of encampment abatements that don't include options for housing should be reconsidered. There need to be permanent and safe and environmentally friendly alternatives to encampments along waterways like the Guadalupe River and Coyote Creek. And then shaded spaces should be a basic provision in encampments, along with food, water, and restrooms. And then I think we also need to think about the ways in which local homeowners may shape the geography of unhoused people, particularly pushing services and unhoused people's residences into some of these more challenged areas in terms of heat risk and other types of environmental exposure. So with that, we really thank you all for your attendance today. We welcome, this is an early draft of our results, and we really welcome your feedback and would love to engage with you in the coming weeks and months about this. So thanks again for organizing this, and we couldn't do this without the funding of the initiative. Thanks.
Thank you all so much for your presentation. I should mention that we invited each of the presenters to present their work in progress. And I want to commend all of them for being able to keep their research going despite the challenges of the pandemic, which have made it so difficult for us to meet and work directly with our community partners, go out and interview people in the community, and so much else. So huge congratulations to people for keeping this work moving. Let's turn to Molly King and Anna Martinez next. Let me go ahead and turn off my video and mute myself. And Molly, why don't you take it away?
Great. Thank you so much, Chad. And thank you so much to the Environmental Justice Initiative for having us today. And thank you everyone for engaging and participating. I'm Molly King. I'm an assistant professor in the sociology department here. And I'll introduce my team in a moment, but I'm here presenting with Maria Gregg and Ana Martinez, two of my very valued research assistants. And we're going to present on how people with disabilities gather and use climate change related information and how they think about that in preparing for emergencies. So in this project, we use interviews to investigate how disability, identity, and information seeking affect the range of potential responses to climate change. So what you'll be seeing today in terms of work in progress is part of a larger interview project. And together with 3 research assistants and 1 alumna, we've been investigating the disproportionate impact of climate change on disabled populations. So like I mentioned, we'll be presenting work in progress on how people with mobility disabilities specifically prepare for and deal with environmental change. So just to introduce you to our team, our presenters, my co-presenters rather, today will be Maria Gregg and Ana Martinez, but we wouldn't be where we are without the additional research assistance of Emily Pashoud and Taylor Shaznoy. So I want to acknowledge them as well. for all of their wonderful research assistance on the project. All right, so I'll turn it over to Maria.
Perfect. So just to go over our methods a little bit, we used snowball sampling to recruit participants for semi-structured interviews that we then conducted over Zoom. And Molly leveraged her identity as a person with a mobility disability to help recruit some of our initial respondents with disabilities. And we also used email lists of people affiliated with different organizations, such as veterans groups or things like that. And we, for our other subgroup of respondents, all initially reached out to people who we knew worked in or studied areas of environmental studies, environmental science, or environmental activism. And then from those respondents, we asked that they refer anyone who they thought might be interested in participating. And by doing so, we collected over 40 interviews over a 16-month period. And as I somewhat mentioned, we focused on two subgroups of people. So people with mobility disabilities and climate change experts or activists. And that helped us to capture both people with disabilities experiences and the experience of people who we knew had to develop awareness and knowledge of climate change issues. And those interviews then were transcribed on ExpressScribe, and we stored them on LSTI, where we've then since been we've been coding and beginning to develop our analysis.
Thanks, Maria. So that sort of gives you a picture of the larger project and how we really intended this as a exploratory project, and we weren't sure where our results would go. But today we're going to focus in on the idea of emergency preparedness and disability and how people gather information about that. What we know is that disability is widespread, and 1 in 4 Americans have a disability. And so as the largest US minority group and a sizable minority worldwide, people with disabilities are an important understudied population, and that includes in the environmental justice realm as well. And so existing literature on environmental justice, documents already the heightened vulnerability of people with disabilities to the effects of climate change, right? That includes to things like heightened vulnerability to heat, related to the last wonderful presentation we just saw. And additionally, there are numerous studies on the relationship of access to information that highlights risk perception and how that relates to taking action to mitigate those risks. But there are no studies yet that sort of link these two ideas, right? That link disability and access to information and climate change action and action to mitigate those risks. And so in our study, we sought to sort of think about those two in tandem. In contrast, formal education and information seeking we know they do enhance the capacity of people with disabilities to prepare for climate change events. And we know that there is a capacity for helping people better understand the risks that they are vulnerable to and helping them learn about those and prepare for them, and including people with disabilities. And so given that people with disabilities are disproportionately affected by natural disasters and yet also disproportionately underprepared for them, having emergency kits on hand may be particularly important for this population because emergency planners are generally underprepared for the needs of the disabled. So we were sort of curious, are folks with disabilities more likely to have emergency kits on hand? Are they aware of these risks? Do they prepare? And so we sort of sought out, among many other questions, to ask our respondents these types of things. And so we learned a lot about what people with disabilities know about climate change. Our respondents reported learning about climate change and climate-related disasters from many different sources. Luckily for those of us in the audience who are educators, many reported learning about climate change from college classes. So that's good for us to know. And a little heartening. And people with disabilities also particularly reported learning from their own personal experiences, more so than climate activists, which we're still exploring further and think is a particularly interesting finding. Others reported learning or changing their mind based on stories from acquaintances or from personal connections. And then, of course, many gathered day-to-day knowledge about climate-related events from social media and online news. And so we're still exploring these results and plan to develop these findings further. We're still working through our transcripts, developing these analyses. But what what we really want to talk about today, as I've alluded to, is this last piece, this piece about emergency preparedness as a slice of our preliminary results. So I'll turn it over to Anna to talk about one of our respondents, Scott, who really highlighted the disparity in this personal relationship with climate change.
Right. So in emphasizing that, Scott said, I definitely don't have the personal experience. I'm not in the minority group. I'm not really in a disadvantaged group either, socially, economically, anything like that. So I don't have those personal experiences. And so this quote just highlights the way that disability intersects with how people approach climate-related events. And another example is from Brian, a 21-year-old Hispanic disabled man who spoke with us about how the air quality affects his quality of life. And so Brian said, definitely how climate change would affect air quality and stuff like that, because air quality is, a lot of my disease has to do with breathing. My lungs aren't as strong as the average person, right? So air quality is something, and I can go out when it's bad air quality, but I know people with my disease who can't go out when there's bad air quality. And so we see here that Brian's disability keeps him from going outside very much when there is severe pollution, and he seeks information about air quality. This contrasts with some of our respondents who are climate activists, one of which who spoke about the way that he drove through an area with an active wildfire and was not concerned, whereas, again, Brian readily checks the air quality before going outside. And so this just serves to emphasize that people with disabilities often, or people's disabilities often cause them to think very carefully about where they live. And another example of this comes from Ash, an Indian man in his mid-40s who discussed his thought process when looking for housing. And Ash said, a lot of the areas that I thought I would want to live in completely went off my list. I'm like, no, the pictures look really pretty being in the redwoods, but now I don't want to be stuck there with wildfires around. So climate change, and the fires specifically, have completely changed what I'm looking for and how close to fire-prone areas that would be. Now, if I'm even just looking for fun at Zillow or one of these sites to say, where do I want to move? I go to calhazards.com, put the address in to see what kind of flooding, fire, earthquake activity they had or not. So for me, I would have never thought of that before, but now it's almost like the first thing I do. And I'm like, oh, wow, no, this place is right in the middle of a fire zone. I'm not going there. I don't even want to consider it. And so like Ash, many people seek out information to facilitate their long-term and daily needs, but they often find it lacking. And for instance, Grace, another respondent, had looked for disability-specific information about evacuation and emergency preparedness with a disability, but had a challenge finding this information. And so Grace voiced that I did have to look up a lot of this information myself, like what needs to be in a go bag, what needs to get safely out of an area. I mean, the acute stuff, like dealing with the fire as it's happening. I feel like that is just public health messaging that didn't happen, at least in the media that I consume, was not present. I don't listen to the radio or watch TV. I'm very much of a millennial, and I couldn't even tell you how I get my news for the most part. And so even more so than Grace, many people with disabilities talked about getting information about climate change or other disaster readiness through their own experience. And one example of this was from Kevin, who is a middle-aged white man with a disability who talked about working in law enforcement and the military and seeing a lot of emergencies through classes in emergency management as a first responder. Additionally, Margaret, who's a white woman with a disability in her late 20s, talked about how her lived experience translates into questions about structural bias. And Margaret said, I think it's much harder from a disaster standpoint, mostly in terms of how we prepare, but also in terms of an immediate response. The slow and incremental step of how we build infrastructure and institutions, it's a lot easier to think how that could benefit people with disabilities. But I think disasters are a place that I worry where people with disabilities get left behind, both intentionally and unintentionally. One, because our rescue systems and response systems are almost never built with people with disabilities in mind. And two, because I think there's, I don't know the right way to phrase it, but in the realm of people who calculate QALYs and dailies, and the, sort of econometrics calculating out what you save in the world type thing, that people with disabilities are devalued in disaster situations when people are asked to place value on people's lives. And so here Margaret is expressing an oft feared sentiment in the disability community that their lives are devalued and not fully considered by rescue institutions, which in this case, again, relates to QALYs, or quality adjusted life years, and dailies, which stands for disability adjusted life years.
Great, thanks. So to summarize our findings from our disabled respondents so far, regarding how they've learned about the threats from climate change and are preparing for them or not preparing for them. So respondents really reported a notable lack of information that was sort of proactively presented to them about how to plan for climate-related emergencies. Some attributed this to feelings of being devalued in society, particularly in institutions of emergency response. And by comparison, climate experts don't always have this same emotional valence around natural disasters. Many did, but it was kind of depersonalized and talked about in terms of other vulnerable populations. And this, we noticed consistently that this sort of embodied knowledge that was drawn from personal experience informed a sense of risk for people, for our disabled respondents. And the difference between how our disabled and non-disabled respondents spoke about risk related to climate emergencies really highlighted the disparities in this embodiment of environmental risk. So that is a result we've been thinking about more. And so one of our next steps is collaborating with a national organization called United Spinal, which will be a community partner we'll work with to address this current lack of disaster preparedness. We'll use surveys to investigate how people are preparing for climate-related disasters before, and then have an intervention where the community organization is already providing sort of disaster kits that are specific to people with mobility disabilities, to their needs in sort of disaster situations, and then see how that changes people's feelings of confidence in the face of disaster. And so hopefully we'll see if this has any effect on rectifying the disproportionate impact of climate-related risks on disabled populations' feelings of risk. And so we just want to thank the Environmental Justice and the Common Good Initiative, and also the College of Arts and Sciences Dean's Office for support for research assistance, and also all of you for attending and for any questions or comments that you might have. We really welcome those, as this is definitely still research in progress. And thank you all for being here today. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Molly. I really appreciate it. I was reminded of something that a disability activist said in a presentation that I was at about 15 years ago. Kind of looked out from his wheelchair and said, hey, look, if you're lucky enough to live to a ripe old age, chances are every one of you, or the vast majority of you in the audience, are going to have a disability at some point in your life. you might want to think about yourselves as temporarily enabled, and you might want to create a world that, an environmentally just world in which all people, including you someday, if you're not in that position right now, would want to live. So thanks for that reminder. And we're really excited to fund the next phase of your research as well, which is really cool. All three presentations also are a good reminder today of the role of students in this research, that at a place like Santa Clara, faculty research is student research, and it's very often undergraduate student research. So I also want to commend the presenters today for involving students meaningfully in the work, and thank the students who presented so well for developing your deep understanding of these environmental justice issues. That's also what we want to support through these grants as well. With that, just want to thank all of you for coming today, give you back 3 minutes of your time, and hope that all of you have a safe and healthy week. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.